So this is the beginning of our quantum mechanics course, and it's a series of lectures that I'm recording to support our online students. And they'll all be on YouTube, and you'll be able to see links to them. So this is the introduction. I'm Dr. Fasano at Monmouth College, and I want to begin with a discussion of why we need quantum mechanics. What's the point? So one of the things that I remember most challenging about quantum mechanics was really the motivation. Like, why are we doing this? It's such a strange and bizarre thing. And we're doing this because we're really forced to it. So I want to set this course and these ideas in a context. So this is really a review in a context. So we'll begin at the end of the 19th century. And at the end of the 19th century, we had made really fantastic strides, great strides of understanding. And so great and so impressive, in fact, that people began to think that maybe physics might be done. So where were we at the end of the 19th century? Well, we had electromagnetism. So Maxwell had completed these equations that are bearing his name. And there are these wonderful four simple, elegant, really beautiful unified equations that unify disparate ideas in an elegant way. And these equations are tremendously powerful, and they described really all of the known electromagnetic phenomena of the day. And they were in many ways the crowning achievement of many years, decades, hundreds of years, if you will, of work. Joining together electricity and magnetism, which had been thought of as separate until Maxwell sort of finally put them all together. So this is this fantastic achievement of the end of the 19th century. People are justifiably proud of it and excited by it, and they think they really have a handle on electromagnetism. Next, there's thermodynamics. So Boltzmann and Helmholtz and Joule and other famous scientists of the time had developed the thermodynamics really to a high art. And thermodynamics is really the flow of heat and energy, and it uses temperature and concepts like that. And it's a wonderful, wonderful subject that is in many ways has become kind of an orphan child almost of physics. It's predominant in chemical engineering and in engineering and in chemistry, and perhaps a little less so, less of its luster. It's really a shame because it was really the centerpiece of education of 19th century physicists, and a 19th century physicist would really have known thermodynamics kind of inside and out, and it's then not surprising when we start to really do quantum mechanics that, given the context of knowing thermodynamics so well, that in many ways quantum mechanics looks like a statistical or a thermodynamic theory. And then finally, we had Newton's laws. And Newton's laws are much older, but they had been fully developed by lots of people. And there's wonderful mathematics, Lagrangians and Hamiltonians, that if you turn mathematicians loose on something for a few hundred years, you get just wonderful things, powerful techniques for calculating and understanding as well. So at the end of the 19th century, you had this sort of triumvirate of these three great subjects that were very well understood and very much kind of under control. So our current physics curricula, really everywhere, reflect this 19th century achievement. So in a place like Monmouth and pretty much everywhere, we have some kind of entry-level sequence, Physics 1, Physics 2, and Physics 3, which are Newton's laws, Maxwell's equations, and thermodynamics. And that comprises, I should say, the education that an entry-level physics student would have. And it's really the entry-level education in physics that most everyone would have: a biologist, a chemist, a chemical engineer, a mechanical engineer. Really, this is the sort of underpinning of all of that. And then in the physics curriculum, we repeat it in a classical mechanics class, an E&M class, and then some combination of thermodynamics and classical and E&M that capture the more advanced techniques. So the 19th century physics is what most people experience as physics, and it's because it's been so tremendously successful. what was left? Was physics done? And physicists thought perhaps that, well, maybe physics would be done, in the 10th decimal place, right? So you do ever more precise experiments and do fine-tuning to get the details right. But we had these pillars of classical physics that, form the basis of really the 19th century understanding, and they were just fabulously successful. And I think you can argue that these ideas, the understandings of these physical consequences really fueled the Industrial Revolution. They made the Industrial Revolution possible. You could build big machines and steam power and electricity, and all of those things were possible because you had this understanding. And it really did kind of lead to a kind of hubris almost that you might argue was how you ended up saying you were building an unsinkable ship, for example. It's probably good at this point to step back and think about the assumptions that have gone into these classical physics ideas, these pillars of physics. What are we assuming? So there are these kind of assumptions that have gone into classical physics, and we make them almost without thinking. It's really important that maybe at this point, before we dive into a quantum world, we think about the classical world that we assumed. So what have we assumed? Well, we assumed that the world is deterministic. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, I mean that it's possible, in principle at least, to determine and know the initial state of a system with arbitrary precision. So there is no, in principle, reason why I can't know everything about a system as precisely as I want. So we can know all the positions and the momenta of all of the constituents of the system at the same time as precisely as we want. Now, this is clearly an in-principle argument. We can't actually do this with 10 to the 23rd molecules. We can't do that. But there's no reason why, in principle, if we had a big enough computer and enough time, that we couldn't do it. So the world is deterministic, and it begins with this idea of being able to know the precision of everything. Okay, what else? Well, given the initial state of a system, we can use interactions like forces or potentials to discover and predict how the system will evolve in time with absolute certainty. So given that we know the beginning perfectly, as precisely as we wish, we can now find the interactions, find the potentials, find the forces, and then use them to compute the future behavior in time absolutely certainly. So we would use Newton's laws or some manifestation like Lagrange and Euler equations or Hamilton's equations to really compute and predict. So again, in principle, because we know the state and the world is deterministic, we can calculate and compute anything we want at any time in the future. Now, we have to know the interactions, and we have to discover the interactions, and we may not know them completely, etc., but there's no reason in principle that we can't do that. So next, position, momentum, and quantities that come from them are continuous. So again, a very basic assumption. There is no discretization. You can put something anywhere you want. You can have any momentum you want, and all of the things that come from those quantities are completely continuous. They are not discrete. They are not, on a grid or anything like that. Okay, some other things that are more, perhaps more focused on thinking about physics. We often in classical physics talk about wave versus particle phenomena. There are things that are waves, like light. There are things that are particles, that are like billiard balls, and they're separate things. They're clearly identifiable. Particles don't interfere, and waves do, for example. So we can clearly separate these phenomena. We can say they're different things, and there's no confusion. There's no overlap. we can clearly identify this thing is a wave and this thing is a particle. And finally, perhaps more subtly, the state of any system can always be known precisely. Always. We can find the precise state, all the positions of momentum precisely with all of the constituents, and it's always in a well-defined state. There is no intrinsic uncertainty, anything. Now, again, practically speaking, we can't do this, right? In a classical system that's a real classical system, it's just too complex. You can't actually do this. If you've got 10 to the 23rd, particles in a gas, you have to have some statistical approach because it's just simply not possible to measure them all in practice. Real systems have uncertainty, but there is no, in principle, reason why we couldn't reduce the uncertainty to be arbitrarily small. So it's now the end of the 19th century, right? And all was well. We had these pillars of physics, right? We had Newton's laws, we had Maxwell's equations, we had thermodynamics. We could use them to build big things, drive the Industrial Revolution. Everything was working great, except for a few problems. And that's what we need to talk about.